most important thing is the camera, so I just kind of throw it in this so it doesn't get all roughed up in there. But I carry a Nikon Z7, and it's pretty good. It's got a full frame sensor, so a pretty big sensor, and then the lens I use is this 50mm macro lens. And the important thing about the macro lens is that it has autofocus, and it's really sharp. And so this camera I like a lot, mostly because it has this focus shift shooting feature. So it can take a lot of pictures and it changes the focus just a little bit each picture. So for shooting focus stacks, I'll show you more about that later.
How much was that camera?
That camera, I think used, they're about $1,200 now for the body, and then the lens about $500 or something like that.
About 2,500 new. I got the same rate as him. But for 600 more, you get the Olympus, which supposedly has a better, we had a lot of back and forth about it. It's very similar camera, but it's easier interface than the menus on this. About $600, I figured, I don't know.
I have an Olympus too, and I stopped using it because the image quality is so much better on these.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So the Olympus doesn't have a full frame camera, and so the sensor on the Olympus is APS-C, which is like half the size of one of these sensors. And it takes great pictures, but if you really zoom in, they're never noise free. There's always like kind of like noise in there, so I end up running all my photos with the denoise stuff. Hello.
Oh.
So that was a Nikon?
So this one is a Nikon Z7. And you can, there's a bunch of very similar cameras.
This one. Oh, you have Z7, this is a 6.
A Z6 II, yeah. So the Z6 is really good too. It's just less megapixels. So the Z7 is 45 megapixels, and the Z6 is like 25 megapixels.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you see very much difference, but then you can crop a little bit more and just have more pixels. But the Z6 is really good too. Any of the Nikon Z series are really good if they have a full frame sensor and they can do focus stacking. There's one of them that's like a lower cost Z that doesn't have the focus shift shooting feature.
So that sounds like a really good thing to have for this stacking though, because you want to get this subtly different.
Oh, yeah.
It's probably the most important feature in the camera, but if your camera doesn't do it, you can just kind of do that manually. It just takes
Yeah, makeshift.
Yeah.
What I usually do anyway, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then if you're going to use a camera, then you pretty much always have to set up a tripod.
Trials.
And so I carry this tripod here. And the cool thing about this tripod is it has no center pull, so it can go pretty low to the ground. And I think going low to the ground is kind of the most important thing for a tripod. So the lowest it can do is about like that, which is not really low enough for half my shots. So then I just carry a bean bag, which is a sock full of, I actually don't know what's in here, even though I filled it. But just like that. So very often, especially for tiny mushrooms, I'm just shooting like that. Or sometimes even that's too high, so I'll just put it on the ground. And sometimes that's even too high, so I'll dig a little hole and then have it so the lens is right at ground level. But generally you want the camera pretty low.
Nick's got a question.
So,
Yeah.
so from a very basic, ignorant, like, type person who doesn't know much about photography, you want to keep it still, what for? To keep the shutter open? To
Yeah, for two things. In the forest, there's not a whole lot of light. So if you're going to be hand holding the camera, you would have to turn the ISO up quite a bit in order to get a fast enough shutter speed to not get motion blur. And also if you're focus stacking, which is more important for tiny mushrooms than large mushrooms, but if you're combining a whole bunch of pictures into one picture, then you want the camera to be pretty still. And so you can hand hold it for both of those things, but it's really best to have it on the tripod. The other really cool thing the tripod lets you do is shoot the same image over and over until it's good. So a lot of times I'll take a picture and then I'll notice that there's like a blade of grass in front of the mushroom, or the lighting isn't right, or there's just something I can improve, so you can just keep taking the picture until you get it right. So I pretty much set up the tripod for every shot, and I don't have to, but one thing I like to do is keep the ISO all the way down. So right now I have the ISO at 16,000, which is really high, and that makes the sensor really sensitive to light, but it also makes the photos a little bit grainy. And the reason it's set to 16,000 is the last time I used this camera, it was 3 in the morning and I was photographing some glowing omphallotus. And those things were super dim, so the moonlight was giving me a lot of competition, but it was working and I got a good picture. But typically ISO, I leave it on 64, and all cameras have what's called the base ISO, and that's a low ISO that gives you the best image quality. So I can put this camera down to 32, but that doesn't make any better image quality than 64. And so when you shoot with a really low ISO, you get the best quality images because there's no grain. But at the same time, you gotta have the shutter open for longer for each shot because it takes longer to capture it. So so the camera needs to be still. And then I just got this umbrella, and I think it's like 15 bucks for 2 of them on eBay. But it's kind of cool because it's kind of translucent. And one thing about mushroom photography is that you never want direct sunlight. Not any direct sunlight anywhere in the frame. And so the umbrella is really good for blocking direct sunlight. Occasionally I've taken good pictures in direct sunlight, but it's only like when I'm doing really kind of weird kind of setups and stuff. Generally, you don't want any kind of direct sunlight.
And even if you're deep in the woods, you may think there's no direct sunlight, but a lot of times there's direct sunlight.
Yeah, there might be like dappled sun in the background, and that's really bad because you don't want a bright spot in the background because it's really distracting. One thing I've started carrying recently that I really like are these pieces of foam. And these I got from Stephen Russell when he ordered bottles, but they're really good both for blocking sunlight, just holding it over, and also for reflecting light up. And so very often I'll kind of like just set these just outside of the frame underneath, kind of just to bounce some light up onto the gills, because the gills are usually the most important part of a mushroom, and usually they're in a really dark shadow, so you can't see the color of the gills. And so just bouncing a little bit of light up is really good. These will make a much more even light than something shiny like aluminum foil. So it's nice to have something white, but you can use like a white t-shirt or a napkin or typing paper, anything white.
Are those slightly translucent?
Yeah, yeah,
So that
they
when
definitely
you're talking-
pass some light.
Yeah.
And a lot of times what I'll do is like take my lights and shine them through this, and it makes it blocks about 90% of the light, but the light that does get through is really soft and diffused, which is really nice.
Put that velvet on the table there. It's probably not what you need, but
Oh yeah.
I sent you that image the other day.
Okay, great. Yeah, I
Yeah.
haven't even looked at that yet. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
So I carry a bunch of these lights, and these lights are really good. And I don't use them all the time, but they're just depending on what you're doing, they can be really good. So occasionally I'll like diffuse it through that just to make it so there's no shadow at all. But I recommend 3 of these, and one of them can go on top of the camera, just in the hot shoe like that. And then the other 2 on the side, like one on this side of the lens and that one on that side of the lens. And just gives you light from all angles, and it completely changes how the image comes out. It can look kind of artificial if you blast it with light. So like these lights, you can turn them down to like 1% and then just have a tiny bit of light. So I usually like it so there's like maybe 10% light from the LEDs and 90% from the sun. But it's really good just to move the lights around and keep your eye on the mushrooms when you're moving it around and just see how it changes, because it changes it a lot. And then also, if you like blast a mushroom with light being really close to it, then the background will be black. It'll be like a jet black background, even if it's in the day. So that can be a really cool effect too. And then it's always nice to see the size of the mushroom, so I'll usually take a picture and throw the ruler in there. But the ruler never looks good in a picture, so the picture that I'm using with the ruler is usually just a quick cell phone photo because there's no reason to take a nice picture that has the ruler in there. But if you're like writing up a species description, you'll want to know exactly the sizes of stuff, and it's really easy to do that with the ruler. And then I carry these ultraviolet lights, and the ultraviolet lights are really nice for fluorescent photography, and these lights are 365 nanometers. So there's two kinds of ultraviolet lights that you'll get. There's 365 and 395. The 395 gives you the purple cast, and that does not make mushrooms light up very well, whereas the 365 is more blue, and the 365 is invisible to the sensor, and so you just see the fluorescence, so it's about 1,000 times better. And the other really important thing is that the lights are really bright. And so these are really bright 365 lights, and you can get lights like this for about 30 bucks on Amazon. And if you're gonna get one, just message me and I'll link you to a good one, because there's also a lot on Amazon that are not as bright. But those are really cool, and they're so bright that you can take ultraviolet photos even in the middle of the day. Another thing I like a lot is black velvet. And this black velvet is called Mozo Black, and it's the world's blackest fabric. And it's not very good for photography, and you can kind of see why, because if you kind of have it at a sharp angle, it's actually pretty reflective. It's only really jet black when it's like straight on. So I prefer other kinds of velvet that absorb light from all directions, and I can link you to some really good velvet on eBay, but also
That's probably pretty similar, if not even a little less quality.
this looks pretty good. It's a little bit shiny,
Yeah.
but it's absorbing. It's not as shiny as this. Like if you hold this at like sharp angles, you can see
Yeah.
this one looks like almost like a velvet dress.
Cool. Yeah.
And then this one, it's absorbing most of the light from most of the angles. So this is really cool, and I will cut this up into little pieces and give everyone some. But what this is really good for is giving you a black background, and that is really cool for a lot of reasons, but one thing is that it makes all the details and the form of the mushroom show up really well. And it's really easy to cut out if you just like need to use it on a web page or something. And
So you put it in back, physically in back of the mushroom?
exactly,
Okay.
yeah. And if you can get it pretty far back, then that's better, because then the velvet itself will be out of focus, so it's just jet black, and you don't have to do any work on Photoshop to get a nice jet black background. If you like set the mushrooms down on the back on the velvet, then it's more like you gotta go in with Photoshop and remove any lint or anything like that that's on the velvet.
Gotcha, yeah.
But another really cool thing to do is like if you have a flower, you know, like a flower will look awesome on a jet black background. So a lot of times I'll just, like if there's a flower right here, I'll just hold my cell phone like this and then just take the picture and just hold this in the background. And even with the cell phone, it can make like a regular flower picture look like really a work of art. So definitely recommend carrying the velvet all the time. And then here's a little paintbrush to knock the dust and dirt off of mushrooms. And you can do that in Photoshop later, but it's a lot quicker just to do it in the field. And then the tackle box is probably the most important thing, just to save everything you photograph. And then for photos of really tiny mushrooms, it's nice to have something for scale that's not ugly. So I have some like little colored pencils, and you can just have the end of the colored pencil kind of poking into the frame, and that looks really cool. And then there's like extra batteries and stuff like that in there. In here I have a couple filters, and there are two filters. This one is the one that I use most often, and this is a circular polarized filter. And circular polarized filter is really useful for cutting the glare. So what happens is a lot of mushrooms are a little bit shiny, either because they're wet or because they're slimy, or they just have like a little bit of sheen on them. So if you take a picture of them, then you'll notice a reflection in the cap, and the reflection is just reflecting the color of the sky. So then if you put this filter on there, then you don't see it cuts the reflection down, so you can actually see the real cap color instead of the sky reflected onto the cap, and that is really nice. But an interesting thing about the circular polarized filter is that it has to be spun just the right way. So this goes onto the lens, and then you can spin the filter like this, and you'll notice that there's some positions where there's like a lot of reflection, and then as you turn the filter, then the reflection gets cut out. And so you just put this on the lens, and then you turn this until the reflection looks best. And then the other filter I have is darker on the top and just passes all the light in the bottom. And so this is mostly for landscape photographers, so the sky is not quite so bright compared to the horizon. But it's kind of cool for mushrooms too, just to make one side a bit dimmer. You know, it's usually the sky, because if you have the camera really low to the ground, you don't want a bright sky. That one I almost never use, but the circular polarized filter I use all the time. But this filter cuts out about half the light, so then you lose half your light, but if you're on a tripod, it doesn't really matter. So sometimes I just leave that on all the time, or other times not. But the circular polarized one is the only one I'd really recommend getting. Here's an extra battery. I almost never use that because the battery in there lasts all day usually. And these things charge with USB-C. So if you have a charger, then you can just charge the camera. This is a USB-C battery. So it's kind of nice because it's real small and light. And so if my cell phone runs low on power, I charge it. But it also can charge the camera or the lights. And here's a little microfiber cloth just for cleaning the lens. And the most important thing about these cloths is that they stay clean. So, because a microfiber cloth that's going to grind like sand or dust into your lens is worse than nothing at all. So I always keep them in a Ziploc. Here's a little holder for my cell phone. So this way I can put my cell phone right on top of the camera and shoot videos. And so usually what I'll do is I'll shoot a video in the camera, and I'll shoot a video on the phone that's on top of the camera, and that way I can put my phone on the tripod, and I can also have a video that's shot both in horizontal and vertical, because I usually want one of each.
They have like the something shoved in the ground that'll hold your phone.
Well, this kind of has a standard 1/4-inch thing like that. So if I wanted
modify it maybe?
Well, I think it's already set up. Like if I wanted to take a regular tripod like this, I can just go like that, and then this would hold my phone like right on the ground.
Perfect, there you go.
Yeah, or just like kind of any regular small tripod can go into there. Another thing about these lights is that they have what's called a cold shoe, and it's just like the same as the hot shoe, except that it doesn't have any electrical connections. They have it on the side so you can like stack the lights like that. And then I have a bunch of little tubes, and these are really good for tiny mushrooms. So a lot of the coolest mushrooms are really tiny, and the reason that they're so cool is that if you have a mushroom that's only 2 millimeters tall, there's nothing that can go wrong with it. If the mushroom's like a foot tall, there's going to be all these bug bites and mud splashed up there and stuff like that. But a 2 millimeter mushroom is going to be perfect and pristine every time. but you're gonna wanna save it, and so putting it into a little tube is really good. And then here's a brand new razor blade. This razor blade is the Feather brand, which is probably the sharpest brand. But this is really good for slicing stuff in half, and you get a much better, cleaner cut than you would with like a pocket knife or something like that. So I always carry a whole bunch of those razor blades. You can,
Yeah, do you ever have problems with the little tubes with the mushroom sweating inside?
absolutely, yeah. You can only stay in the tube for, it's like putting a mushroom in a plastic bag. They're fine for an afternoon,
Yeah.
but yeah, they're going to get rotten in there if you don't take them off and dry them.
Yeah, I have these little things.
Yeah, and if it's
I
too
drill
tiny
holes,
though,
yeah.
then it's gonna get lost even in a box like that. But
Yeah, you have to be careful.
yeah.
This one does
If
not
it's
have
really-
the removable sections.
yeah,
little
if
stuff
it's really
is
tiny, you
important.
could just throw tubes in the box and then the tubes won't get lost.
Right.
Drill a hole in the little tubes.
Yeah, I suppose you could. I don't think it would really dry very well in a tube, even with a hole on
Yeah,
there.
because it would be so small, that hole.
Yeah. I keep an extra lens cap because these things are really easy to lose, although I don't always use the lens cap, and sometimes I'll lose a lens cap and just go months without it. That seems to be fine, but here's like a little Allen wrench to tighten up the legs on the tripod if I want. And magnifying glass is really nice for just like seeing slime molds and tiny mushrooms on logs and stuff like that. And I don't use this anymore because I have an app on my phone called Flashlight Magnifier, and it just turns on the light on your phone and use the macro mode on your phone to magnify, and I think that might be better than an old-fashioned lens. And then a really good thing is the tweezers, and the tweezers are for organizing little tiny mushrooms. A lot of times I'm trying to set up a bunch of little mushrooms and my fingers are so big that when I try to go in there to move one mushroom, it like moves all of the other ones out of place. Or if you're just trying to like remove a pine needle from the middle of your setup, a lot of times if you don't have the little tweezers, then it just like messes everything up and knocks things over. So it's really nice to have the tweezers to also just to get rid of like little specks of dirt and stuff like that. And here's a lighter just to start a fire in case I get stuck out there. And some potassium hydroxide is really good for color change reactions. Might be almost everything.
That's enough.
Yeah, there's a lot of things.
Did you mention tweezers?
Yep. I think you stepped out for a second. I pulled the tweezers out.
It's amazing, and you take a photograph and then you don't realize there was so much stuff on it. that You gotta go to Photoshop to remove it. It's like a surprising.
Yeah, one of the best things to do, whether you're on a cell phone or a camera, is to take a close look at your picture after you take it before you walk away from the mushrooms, because often there's something wrong, like the focus won't be just right, or there'll be a little bit of sunlight, or there will be, any one of a million problems, but it's really good just to make sure the picture looks really good while you're still there.
If you're photo stacking, do you take just a single shot for that purpose at the beginning to sort of adjust your settings?
What I do is I will set up the tripod and set everything up, and then I will take one shot at the beginning and then look at the RGB histogram to make sure that the exposure is just right, and color balance and just all that stuff, and the lightings, make sure it's just right. And then I'll delete that shot, because if I don't delete it, it's easy to accidentally include it into the stack. And then I'll start the stacking.
Oh, just so everyone knows, there's a thing of ice water right out here if anybody wants and cups. If
Ah,
anybody
cool.
wants water.
So when you're engaged in serious photography out in the field, how many specimens do you expect to be able to photograph in a day, let's
If
say?
I'm out there all day and I'm taking really good pictures, about 20. But I'm rarely out there all day, because if I'm out there for 8 hours collecting mushrooms, then that's 8 hours of computer work that I need to do to get all of those photos stacked and processed and uploaded, and that doesn't leave enough time in the day to sleep. So more often, I'll go out for like 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon, and then there's like 2 or 3 hours of photo editing and a couple hours of vouchering and drying and everything, and that leaves me enough time to sleep, which is really important.
I like harvesting vegetables, you gotta be home, enough time to process them before you go to bed.
Well, I sort of do both, but of course my photography and processing and all that is like pretty primitive compared to this, but it still takes a long time. And like Alan just said, you take sometimes several pictures to see like what's wrong and correct what's wrong and correct. With my little, $200 camera, I'll take, if I find something that I think is interesting, I'll take 30 or 40 photos, put them on my computer later on and see.
And then see which one you like best.
See which one is okay. Sometimes out of 30, there's 1 or 2.
Yeah, I think if you spend a little bit more time and care with setting up the photo and everything,
Right.
then you can make them turn out right the first
That's
time.
kind of what I'm
more.
doing.
Yeah. I imagine everyone that's coming is here, you think, Gary? So for this, first we'll talk about composition, and then getting a good photo with a cell phone, and then how to use a camera to get a good photo. And with cell phones, I use the cell phone for every mushroom because I want to be able to have an iNaturalist observation for everything. So my camera does not have a GPS in it, and it's really nice to have an exact point on the map for where you found the thing. And so, yeah, for every mushroom, I will take a cell phone photo with the iNaturalist app, and then I'll create their observation when I'm right there sitting in front of the mushroom. And when you do that, you can make sure that the GPS locked down right, because it shows you the accuracy of the GPS coordinates. And then anything that's not obvious from the photo, like the texture and the taste and the nearby trees, I'll write it in the notes. And then if the mushroom is really cool and I think it's worth spending more time on, then I'll set up the camera and tripod and everything. But you don't really have to set that up every time, because a lot of times a cell phone photo is good enough. If it's just something for barcoding and just to document that it was there, a cell phone photo is fine. Or if it's a really big mushroom or a bunch of big mushrooms, the cell phone photos do really well. It's just that it's the tiny mushrooms where the cell phone photos do not do well. So I generally like several specimens in various stages of development. So really young ones, really old ones. And it's really important to have the stem bases in there. So if you cut the stem base off, then the photo is never going to look very good. So if you're collecting edibles for the table, you'll want to pop them out of the ground from below with a knife, and then photograph them, and then cut the stem base off and leave the stem base in the woods, and then just bring the rest of the mushroom. Hello.
Yeah.
And I just started this like 10 seconds ago, so you're not super late.
You need a check?
Yes, sure.
Have you got help?
So the best time to photograph mushrooms is maybe 3 or 4 days after rain. If it's like raining that day or the day before, a lot of the mushrooms are waterlogged, and they're not going to look that good when they're waterlogged, and it also washes a lot of the features off of them. And then after like a week, they'll start to dry out maybe. So ideally, they'll be really fresh, but not dry, but not waterlogged either. And so what I like to do is find a group of natural group of mushrooms, and then lay a few other mushrooms down in front of them, kind of some really mature ones and some really young ones and something in between. And for some reason, odd numbers of mushrooms look way better than even numbers. So one mushroom just a picture of a single mushroom will look awesome. A picture of 2 mushrooms will look stupid. 3 mushrooms will look awesome. 4 mushrooms will look stupid. And it's not just mushrooms. It's that way for like sculpture and painting and really anything. It's just something about the human brain. It looks way better when there's
Food on
odd
a plate
numbers.
is that way too. Yeah.
What's that?
Food on a plate.
Oh my gosh, I never knew that. You're
Yeah.
so right.
Yeah, because that's what we always did odds. You never could do even. It's like bad luck too. I think.
Yeah, that makes a
In
lot
some
of sense.
cultures.
Yeah, I've never thought about that before. My food's gonna be like a third more delicious now that I know how to lay it out properly. And then mushrooms never look good just from above, unless you're doing like a real close-up of the cap or something like that. But generally you want the camera pretty close to the ground. And so here I have some that were just naturally growing in the background, and then I laid a few out, kind of like some little ones where you can see the veil here, and then here's one I cut in half so you can see the inside, and the inside's called the context, and if you don't cut it in half then you'll never know what color the inside was, but usually it's not that pretty, so it's kind of like you're taking more of a scientific photo. You'll cut one in half.
You had 16 there though.
Yeah. Yeah, if you have like a whole bunch of them, the exact number probably doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
It's more like for the amount that I'm laying down in front. And of course, all rules should be broken occasionally.
Well, I think there's probably a difference in photographing for photo documentation of traits as opposed to trying to get really pleasing photos.
Yeah, and I usually try to do both. So I try to show the important traits, but also make it look really good.
Mm-hmm.
And that way I'm kind of bridging the gap between science and art. And it makes the art better because there's science in it, and it makes the science better because it's artistic and looks good. But it's nice to have something in there for scale. And it used to be when you collected mushrooms, you had to write a description, like paragraphs of every mushroom before you put it in the herbarium. And that's not as important now that we have photos, but still if you're gonna write up a new species or just know how big everything is, you need something in there for scale. So it could be something like a penny or whatever, but if you have something in there for scale, then you can take your picture, load it into Piximeter, which is a software I use to measure spores with a microscope. But you can just load any camera photo into Piximeter and calibrate it on that, whatever it is, the penny or the ruler, and then you can just click around the image and measure out all of the stems and caps and just measure everything really quickly.
Yeah, and I found also that if you use like a penny, you want one that's not new and shiny because it sort of is distracting.
Yeah, it'll definitely be super reflective, although I think anything you put in there for scale is going to be distracting and will detract from the shot unless it's like the tip of a colored pencil or something like that. And so,
Does that app only work if a camera is like parallel to the subject? Because if it's like kind of at an angle, won't it be like skewed, or does it have to be
if it's an angle, you're really just looking for like, if you use a penny, like the diameter of the penny.
Okay.
And so I think no matter how the penny is facing, it'll still have pretty much the same diameter, and that's what you're going to be measuring against. But it is good if it's kind of like really near the mushrooms, because if it's closer to the lens, it'll be a little bit, scale will be a little bit off. But the exact measurements don't matter too much. And so here's one, and without this coin, you would never know that the boletes are super tiny. So these boletes, they only get, like, the cap is like the size of a dime. And then a lot of times the mushrooms, you need to cut them open. Like this thing, it just looks like a rock until you cut it open, and then it's really beautiful in the middle. And all of the piezolythus are like that. So it's really nice to have a bean bag, just to have your camera on the ground. And then really important thing is to remove all the debris from the front of the mushroom. Because you have two eyes, you kind of ignore any debris because you can see around it. But the camera is just one lens. And so if you have a pine needle or a blade of grass going across the front of the mushrooms, it'll kind of ruin the shot. And that's one reason that it's nice to take a close look at your picture before you walk away from the mushrooms, just to make sure that there was no pine needle or anything.
Yeah, and when you move stuff, you have to be careful because stuff has a tendency to be stuck to other stuff.
For sure.
And sometimes you can knock your mushrooms over if you're not
Yeah,
careful.
you want to do it
Stuff
real
out of them.
slowly, and often with the tweezers, especially if it's tiny mushrooms. But yes, it's even really common that you break the mushroom when you grab the stick to rip it out of there. It just like takes the chunk out of the cap of a mushroom. And there are ways to fix that now with the AI parts of Photoshop, but it's way better if the cap is just not broken in the first place. And then one thing I've been doing recently is I pay more attention, or as much attention, to the background as I pay to the foreground. And it's especially if there's things that are bright in the background. You don't want anything brighter than the mushroom in the background. And so it's usually like a piece of dead grass, or a bright colored stick, or a bright colored leaf, or like a sunbeam coming down through the trees. You don't want any of that behind the mushroom. So I always make sure that there's only dark colored things behind the mushrooms, because it's really distracting when there's something light behind the mushroom. And that kind of stuff is almost impossible to remove with Photoshop later. So it's best just to do it when you're out there in the field. And then it's a really good idea to shade the background. And so you want most of the light like in the foreground, lighting up the mushroom. And so one way to do that is to put lights kind of near the mushroom, because the closer the light is to the mushroom, the brighter it'll be compared to the background. But the other way to do that is to like take your backpack and prop it up so it casts a shadow behind the mushrooms. Or if you're out with a bunch of friends, just have them stand to cast their shadows. And sometimes you have to line like 3 or 4 people up if it's a big mushroom to make the shadow long enough to cover all the background. But it's really nice to be able to have the darkest background you can. And a lot of times if there's like really dark, wet leaves around, I'll throw those behind the mushrooms just to kind of cover up anything that's not dark. And so here's some wood chips and some gymnopilus from New Zealand, and these were in full sunlight. So I had to have a couple friends stand to cast enough shadow where I don't have any patches of light in the background. And again in here, I think with this one, it was a really cloudy day because it was in Washington, so I didn't have to shade it too much. And here's Lepiota luteophila. This is probably the world's rarest mushroom because the only place it grows is about 10 feet by 10 feet in California, and it hasn't been found anywhere else in the world. And here's one with the black background, the black velvet. So this is just kind of a boring crust, and it would have been a boring photo, but then putting it on the black velvet made it kind of a cool picture. And then here's a macro photo of Mycena, what they used to call Mycena corticula. And this one, you can see that there's a ton of light coming up from below, probably too much. So if you have too much light coming from below, then it looks kind of artificial. I like it when there's some light coming up into the gills, but not so much that it looks like you put a mirror under the mushroom. But it kind of depends on what you're going for, because it still looks cool, but it doesn't look very natural. And then here is a super rare morel. It only grows in Mount Shasta and in Turkey, and it was described from Turkey. It's Morchella magnaspora. But there's one spot in Mount Shasta where it grows, and we went out there, and there was only one of them. And so I had to make it look kind of cool. And so what I did is I had this piece of fabric that was kind of like a Thanksgiving tablecloth with like silly bright leaves and stuff like that. And by having it out of focus in the background, it adds lots of color. So it makes the picture kind of interesting. And it's a really good idea to add some part of the thing that's important for the mushroom. So like with this mushroom, it's a Swillis, it's mycorrhizal with pine. And so I have a pine cone from the nearby pine, and there's a couple of needles, so you can see how long the needles are and how many needles are in a cluster. And then for mushrooms that have that are with oak. It's really good to have an acorn and an oak leaf in there. That's the Amanita hollandiana from Michoacan. And sometimes it's nice to try to include a lot of the background, a lot of the forest in the photo as well. So in this one you can see the mushrooms really well, but you can also see the forest pretty well. You can see like what kind of habitat they're in. And there's two ways to do that. One way is with the wide angle lens on your phone. So that works pretty well because with the wide angle you can just make sure it's focused on the mushrooms, but you'll be able to see all of the context and where the mushrooms are. This one I did with a wide angle macro lens, so it's a 15mm lens, and those lenses are very difficult to use for a bunch of different reasons, but they can make pretty good shots like this, but your phone can also do the exact same shot.
The scale of those mushrooms, they look like they're 3 feet in diameter.
Yeah, they do.
That's beautiful.
This one's also taken with the 15mm macro lens. So it's really good to look up at the gills of the mushroom. So if you have the mushroom kind of up above where the camera is, then it's really, it's really nice just because the gills are the most interesting part of the mushroom. And a lot of times the gills look really cool. Like if I had just shot these from above, it would be really boring. They just look like kind of like potato chips or something. And the black velvet can make things look really nice. So it's definitely possible to get really good mushroom photos out of a cell phone if the mushrooms are big mushrooms. And the cell phone pictures are really good because they're so fast, so you don't need to set up a camera and tripod or anything. But the background is usually doesn't look quite as nice. So the character of a background is called the bokeh. And if you have an expensive lens, then you usually get a very nice blurred background or a nice bokeh. Whereas if you're using a cell phone, or if you have the aperture closed, then the bokeh does not look as nice, and the mushrooms don't stand out as much from the background. And your eye will kind of get drawn to the background. Now, one thing about a cell phone is that you can't change the aperture. So if you want to change the depth of field on a cell phone, which is how much is in focus at once, the way you do that is by moving the camera closer or further away. So if you take a picture with your cell phone, you notice that some of the mushrooms are in focus, but others are blurry because there's just not enough depth of field. You can just put back the cell phone further away and then zoom in on your screen. And you'll get less resolution because you're using the digital zoom, but you'll get more depth of field. And if you haven't backed up too much, you probably have enough resolution. And the really nice thing about the cell phone is that you don't have to process the images later. The cell phones do a ton of processing automatically, instantly when you take the picture. And that's all stuff that photographers usually will do in Photoshop or Lightroom later. And it's really nice to be able to take the photos with the iNaturalist app, so you don't have to remember to upload the photos later. And at the end of the day, usually what you'll want to be doing at the end of the day is writing down the iNaturalist number of all of your collections on little slips of paper, and then you put all the mushrooms on those little slips, put them on the dehydrator. And so if you have to process your photos before you can do that, then you'll never get those numbers down, and it's really easy to mix up the mushrooms. But if you took a really quick cell phone photo and then a really good camera photo, you don't have to process the camera photos that day. You can always just go with the cell phone photo, and then like when the DNA sequence comes back, if it comes back and it's something really cool, then you can go back and process the camera photos. But here's a picture I took with the cell phone. It's nice and sharp and there's nothing wrong with it. And then I took the same picture with my camera and focus stacking. And it's also nice and sharp, and it's almost impossible to see the difference between these two pictures, even on a really nice screen. But for like little tiny mushrooms, like here's some little lactarius, doesn't really look very good with a cell phone compared to how it looks with the camera and focus stacking. So the smaller a mushroom is, the more important it is to use a camera. So the most important thing is where you hold the phone, because putting the phone in a different spot makes the picture turn out really differently. So generally closer to the ground. If you want to get the camera directly on the ground, you can just flip your phone upside down. Or sometimes you can put your phone into selfie mode and kind of slide it underneath the mushrooms, if it's kind of a tall mushroom, and then you're looking up and you get all the leaves in the background, and that can look really cool. The most important setting that you can change on the phone is the exposure compensation. And so if you have a lighter colored mushroom on a darker background, which is usually the case, you need to lower the exposure compensation. But if you have a darker mushroom on a lighter background, which is the case when you're photographing like a black earth tongue, or if you just have like a bunch of mushrooms on a paper plate, then you have to raise the exposure compensation. And on an iPhone, here's how you do it. What you would do is just tap on the mushroom, and then this little sun appears. And if you drag the sun down, it will lower the exposure compensation. And if you drag the sun up, it'll raise the exposure compensation. So dragging it up makes the photo brighter, and dragging it down makes the photo dimmer. And the thing you really want to watch out for here is not blowing out the highlights. So if most of your image is dark, but you have some white mushrooms on there, and you don't change the exposure compensation, then the dark background will look really good, but you'll lose all of the detail on the white mushrooms because the highlights will be blown out. And when you blow out the highlights, what's happening is that the camera is saving the data in ones and zeros, and when a pixel is all ones, then there's just no room for detail. And so it's just gonna lose all of the detail. So by turning down the exposure compensation, you have a good mixture of ones and zeros, and you'll still have detail in the brighter parts of the image. On a camera, the exposure compensation is here. So if you have a darker mushroom on a lighter background, you'll want to shoot around -1 to -2, and the exact opposite for earth tongues. But you can never make an image darker once the highlights are blown out, that data's gone. But you can always go in a photo editor and make things brighter. And the only penalty there is you get more noise in your image, but that's not nearly as bad as blown out highlights. So it's a good idea if you're gonna shoot on to always shoot on the side of a photo that's too dark, and then you can always brighten it later. So a lot of times I do need to photograph a tiny mushroom on a cell phone. So to make a tiny mushroom on a cell phone turn out as well as it possibly can, you need the phone as close as possible. So I move the phone as close as I can to the mushroom until it starts getting blurry because it's too close. And then I back off the phone until it's nice and sharp. And then I'll use the digital zoom to zoom in so it fills the screen. And that's the best you can do. The different phones have different lenses. My phone is a Samsung S24, and with that phone, the best lens for macro photography is the telephoto lens. And it's really good if your phone is like that, because then you get lots of light coming in there. On something like an iPhone, the best lens for a tiny mushroom is the wide angle lens. And the wide angle lens, you have to be extremely close, like maybe an inch or less, to be able to get the macro. And so when your phone is only an inch away from the mushrooms, it's going to be blocking most of the light, and it's hard to get light in that close. And so you can use these clip-on lenses. And one thing you notice about the clip-on lens is the price is $15. You can also get clip-on lenses that are $30 or $100 or $200, but they're not any better than a $15 one. And then they do have these little microscope things, so something like this, they'll magnify 200 times. And it's not nearly as good as an actual microscope, but it can be kind of cool. But the more magnification you have, the less depth of field you get, and the harder it is to fiddle with it in order to get the thing in focus. But here's the phone I have, a Samsung S24, and it's really expensive, but I like it a lot because the macro photos actually are really good. But there's a bunch of other phones around that have really good macro photos as well. And you know, if you have, like, this thing here, it kind of looks like hygroscopy, except it has little hairs coming off of it. And so you can tell the difference between like retinella fibula and a hygroscopy. And you can only do that with a phone that's pretty good, because most phones, especially if you're not super close, you won't have the detail you need to tell those two apart.
Sometimes I take photos of small stuff through my loop.
Yeah, and that totally works. You just have to have it positioned just right.
Yeah, so I'll take a lot of them. As I said
Yeah, that's a
before.
good idea.
Yeah.
So now I'll talk about how to get a good photo out of a camera. And one of the most important things you can change on the camera is the aperture. And so the aperture is represented with this number here. And so at f2.8, the lowest number, the aperture is all the way open. And this aperture is a physical thing inside the lens that opens and closes. And then at f32, the aperture is really small, like a pinhole. So at f2.8, you're letting a ton of light in, and you don't need a very slow shutter speed. However, the depth of field is really narrow. But the background will look awesome because it'll be really blurry. And then at f32, you have things that are close and far in focus at the same time. However, because the aperture is just a little pinhole, you'll have to keep the camera still for a couple seconds in order to gather enough light. And the background is going to be in focus too, so it might be really distracting. So you just change the depth of field by changing the aperture. And lenses are sharpest at f8, so they get a little bit less sharp if you open it up all the way, but it's such a tiny difference that you'll never notice it. But if you close the aperture down to f32, they get significantly less sharp. But unless you're zooming into 100%, you'll never notice that either. And the character of the background is a way bigger thing. But if you want the best, the most sharpness you can possibly get, probably because you'll be cropping, because it's a really tiny thing and you're going to crop that part of the image, then you'll want to set the aperture to somewhere around f8. And here's what the aperture actually looks like. So when it's all the way open like this, you're getting much less depth of field, and when it's really closed, you get a lot more depth of field. And here's a picture I took with the aperture wide open. So you can see that only a little bit of the image is in focus. And then when I close it down to f8, I get a little bit more in focus. And then f32, so this is the farthest, the most closed that it gets. It's still getting a little blurry at the very closest and very furthest parts, but you get quite a bit of depth of field there. And then with focus stacking, you can see that I have as much depth of field as I want. So everything that's close to the camera is razor sharp. And then when I stop focus stacking, it gets very blurry very quickly because the aperture was wide open when I took these pictures.
How do you stop the focus stacking? Don't you start at a certain point and it automatically?
So I stop the focus stacking later on the computer, and that's just when I choose which images I'm going to stack. And so what I do is I will choose images that have all of the foreground. So one thing I've learned to do recently is always try to start the focus stack really early, because I want the foreground to be nice and sharp. It doesn't look very good when you have really blurry things in the foreground. And so when I am focus stacking, what I'll do is focus the camera so the very closest part of the foreground is in focus. And then I'll just have the camera keep taking pictures until the back of the subject is in focus. But usually you accidentally include some of the background. And so when you're actually in Lightroom and you're deciding which pictures to include in the stack, you usually don't want to include those background photos in the stack because you want the background to be as blurry as possible. So you want to stop the stack just after the last photo that shows the back of the background, back of the subject. here's a photo that's taken with the aperture wide open, and you can see only this part of the image of the mushroom is in focus, and the rest of it is really blurry. And then when I close the aperture, the whole thing is in focus. And here's a few pictures I took of a butterfly at the different apertures. And this one, don't really look at the butterfly because the butterfly is going to be in focus for all of these, but look how the background changes. So with the aperture wide open, you can see the background looks really nice. It's really blurry and your eye is drawn to the plant and the butterfly. But at f8, the background starts to come into focus a lot more, and f16 even more, and then f25 was all the way closed. And the butterfly doesn't stand out very well at all from the background. And so here's one that I just shot a bunch of stuff at different apertures, and you can't really see very much difference. Because like something like motion blur will make your photos really blurry, but closing down the aperture up to f25 causes a type of blur called diffraction blur, just because of the size of the light waves going through the aperture, and it's not very bad compared to motion blur. Another thing that you can change on your camera is the ISO. And the ISO is the sensor sensitivity. So when you turn the ISO up to a high number, the sensor is super sensitive. And then you can take a really fast picture. But if you turn the ISO all the way down, then the same picture, you have to leave the shutter open for a couple seconds to gather all the light that you need. But when you really zoom in, that picture will be much higher in quality. So the highest quality will be on what's called the base ISO. And the base ISO is different for every camera, but it's usually 100 or 200 or 64. And then if you go lower than the base ISO, you have to leave the shutter open longer, but your pictures don't get any better. So that's only good for like waterfalls and stuff like that, where you're trying to stop the motion. And if you're just holding the camera in your hand and you're not setting it on a tripod, your pictures are going to look way better if you turn the ISO up, because motion blur is so much better than the graininess that you get from the high ISO. So motion blur you can't really fix. The high ISO noise is really only a problem when you're zooming in, and you can fix that with post-processing. And then if you're just holding the camera in your hand and you're not setting up a tripod, the automatic ISO can be pretty nice, because if you have a ton of light, then it'll automatically turn the ISO down. And if you don't have very much light, it'll automatically turn the ISO up. But if you are on a tripod, you want to turn off auto ISO, because you can afford to leave the shutter open for a second or two and gather a lot of light and get a better quality picture if your camera's not moving. Here's a picture I took of my friend Iñaki walking across a bridge in a pretty dark cloud forest in Mexico. And you can see it looks fine, but I had to shoot it at ISO 25,000 because he was moving and it was a pretty dark area. But if you really zoom in, it's pretty grainy. And then but you can fix that either in Photoshop or in a program called Topaz. It does a really good job of using AI to fix that graininess. So if you run it through one of those programs, then you can afford to shoot at pretty high ISO and still get good pictures. And then another setting you have in your camera is how to save the images. And your choices are as JPEG or as RAW. And every professional photographer in the world will tell you that you need to save all of your images as RAW images, because the raw images contain a whole lot more data. So when you take a picture, your camera is always taking a raw picture, and then it processes that raw image into a JPEG and will save the JPEG. And when it's processing it into the JPEG, it's compressing the image and it's throwing away all of the invisible data. So there's a lot of invisible data that's in the shadows that's just getting thrown away in JPEG. And so if you want to be able to post-process later and bring out that detail in the shadows and make it so you can see what's in the shadows, then if you shoot in RAW, you'll be able to do that a whole lot better. However, raw images are huge and you fill up your hard drive really fast, and they're much slower to process. Just on CPU time, it can take longer to load and everything. And I find if I shoot in both RAW and JPEG, and then I process both of them, the JPEGs usually look better. And so I very rarely use this raw image thing, but it kind of depends on the camera and your post-processing flow, so you should definitely try shooting in RAW. If you shoot in RAW, you can shoot dimmer, because you can raise the levels of everything more than you can in JPEG. So usually what I'll do is if I find something I'm like, oh, this would be a really good magazine cover, it's an amazing picture, then I will turn on RAWs. But 99% of the time I don't have my camera saving RAW because I don't have tons of hard drive room. If I shot in RAWs, I would need probably 20 or 30 external hard drives, but since I'm mostly shooting in JPEG, I can have 5 years of my photos on just 2 external hard drives. But here's an example of a picture that you might want to shoot in RAW, and the reason is that this is a little cordyceps coming out of a weevil, and the weevil was pretty dark in color, but this top part here was super bright, and so I had to turn the exposure compensation way down to like -4 to not blow out the red channel on this, on the cordyceps itself. And then when you turn it down that much, the bug was almost black. So because I shot it in RAW, I was able to raise the shadows on the bug so you can see the details on the bug, but not lose the detail on the bright parts of the image. So the RAWs do that better than JPEGs. But there is a feature in the camera that I really like, and it's called active delighting on Nikon. Canon probably calls it something different. I think all cameras have something like it, but what it does is when it processes the JPEG, it raises the shadows. And so I always turn that active delighting up to high, because that way, that's the main thing that you can do with RAW processing, is to raise the shadows. So this automatically does it in camera when it saves the JPEG. So if I have that turned up to high, then the JPEGs that it saves are much closer to RAWs. Another thing you can do to make your JPEGs more like RAW images is turn down the vibrance and the color saturation. Because if the saturation is up and it gets too saturated, you can never turn the saturation back down again. But if the saturation is lower and the photos look flatter and more neutral, you can always turn the saturation up in Photoshop or just in an app on your phone. Another super important thing with the camera is the shutter speed, just how long the shutter is open. And so if anything is moving, you need a faster shutter speed in order to freeze the motion. And so whether it's the camera moving because you're holding it in your hand, or the subject is moving because they're like just walking or whatever, you need the faster shutter speed. But then mushrooms usually are not moving, and so you can usually get away with a low shutter speed if the camera is really still, like it's just sitting on the ground or something. And then the shutter speed that you need when you're hand holding really depends on which lens you have. So if you have a 15mm wide angle lens, you can get away with a 1/30th of a second shutter speed. Whereas if you have a 300mm zoom lens, like for birds, you would need a 1/600th of a second shutter speed in order to not get a blurry photo just from the motion in your hands. And so, yeah, main reason I use the tripod is just so I can get away with the long shutter speed and the low ISO. And the mode that I have the camera on, you have all those modes, and the main thing that those modes affect is the shutter speed. So if I'm not using a tripod, then I like to turn the camera to the S mode, or like Canon calls it the TV mode. And what that mode does is that you tell the camera the shutter speed, and then it calculates the aperture and the ISO based on how much light it needs to gather for that shutter speed. So if I'm walking around with a 100mm lens, I will go to the S mode and I'll set the shutter speed to 1/200th of a second. And that way, no matter how much light is in the scene, the camera won't be shooting any slower than 1/200th of a second. So even in dark places, I will not get motion blur. If the camera is not moving, if I'm on a tripod, then I always use the A mode, Nikon calls it A, Canon calls it AV, but that's the aperture priority mode. And aperture priority means that you tell the camera the aperture, and then it calculates the shutter speed and everything else based on the aperture. So if you're on a tripod, the only thing that's really going to affect how the photo turns out is the depth of field, and that's directly related to the aperture. So that's why if the camera's not moving, I'm always on the A mode. And then the manual mode, I only use that at night because it's kind of like a stick shift transmission where some people really like being on M all the time, but it's kind of unnecessary, and metering the light is something that computers are really good at, so there's no reason you have to meter the light for every picture you take. But at night, I'm adding light, and therefore metering the light doesn't work at all. And so if it's totally dark out, I will turn on my lights and then set the focus and set the shutter speed, and then turn off my lights and then take the picture.
If you're using aperture mode on a tripod, what sort of basic setting would you be using?
So aperture mode on the tripod, it's going to shut I will always have the ISO set to the base ISO of my camera, which is 64 on my camera and also on yours. And then it's going to choose the shutter speed just based on how much light is in the scene. And if it's choosing a shutter speed that's really long, like 1 second or longer, then if I'm doing a focus stack of 60 photos and it's 1 second exposure, then that's gonna take a while, like 1 minute. And so if it's really dark and it's trying to do like a 3 second exposure, then I will turn the ISO up, even though I'm on a tripod, so I don't have to sit there for like 6 minutes as it's taking the pictures. That usually happens just after sunset every day. Did that answer your question?
We'll talk more about it later.
Okay. So here's an example of motion blur, and there is no way to fix motion blur. And so you just can't do it, and so you have to make sure that there's no motion blur in your photos. Here's another example of motion blur, but in this image, the mushroom is moving and not the background. And it turned out pretty cool. What happened here is that the black velvet just fell on the mushroom as I was in the middle of a focus stack. But it's probably one of the cooler pictures I've ever taken because the lint on the black velvet was fluorescent. And this is just me shooting an ultraviolet photo in the middle of the day, so just covering everything with black velvet. So I'd have a little bit of darkness for the ultraviolet photo, but it fell. And then here is an example of a really long exposure. And so this was a 1/2 second exposure. When you have a long exposure and there's something moving in there, then it smooths everything out. So with the moving water, you have the water looks really nice and it gives you a very peaceful feeling. Here's a waterfall that I found in Veracruz, and this one is a 1/2 second exposure, so it gives you a really peaceful feeling, but then I took the same picture with 1/125th of a second exposure, and that just stops the action, so you can see that the water looks really different depending on the shutter speed. Mushrooms aren't moving usually, so that doesn't make as much of a difference, but occasionally there'll be a little coprenoid that is blowing in the wind, and you might need a faster shutter speed in order to not have that blurry. And then one of the most important settings is the exposure compensation, and that's just the brightness of the image. And so it's usually there's like this little plus minus thing, or sometimes it's like a little wheel that you turn to make it brighter and dimmer, but you pretty much always want to make it a little bit too dim because there's usually something in the photo that's a little bit brighter, and if it's too bright, then you will lose all the detail on that. The color balance is something that makes no difference at all if you're shooting in RAW, but if you shoot in JPEG, then you have to set the color balance correctly because you can only change the color balance a little bit in Photoshop or in your other photo editors. You can only change it a little bit later, and if you try to change the color balance a lot later, then the color, you're missing a lot of colors and it looks really bad. So the automatic is usually a pretty good choice, but depending on the different colors in your photo, automatic might get it wrong, especially if there's a whole lot of one certain color. the automatic color balance works by making sure that there's enough of the all the different colors, but if everything is the same color, then automatic color balance might do a really bad job. But here's just a picture I took with a whole bunch of different kinds of color balance, just so you can see how it changes. And you can see the automatic did a really good job. And cloudy is too yellow, so even everything in the leaves are too yellow, and cloudy almost always does that, even if it is cloudy. And then the shade is even way too yellow, like everything's ridiculously orange. And then incandescent is way too blue. So when the color balance is this far off, then if you weren't shooting in RAW, you'll never be able to fix the colors and make it look nice again. But here in fluorescent, it's pretty close. The color balance isn't too far off, so you would be able to fix that later.
When you say fix the colors, you mean you're gonna be going through Photoshop? to fix
Exactly. And in Photoshop, you can adjust the color temperature, which is the balance of blues to yellows,
the curve.
or the tint. And the tint is the balance of magentas to greens. And so you can change it like maybe 10% or something in a JPEG without making it look terrible. And then another custom balance, color balance that's kind of cool is the custom balance. And what you do with that is that you put something in the frame that's gray, a neutral color, and then you set the color balance based off of that gray thing. You can use like a little gray card or something. And the reason to do that is because the light that filters into the forest is never completely white, because the leaves are green, maybe you're wearing a blue shirt. There's always like, the light that is hitting your mushroom is always going to be colored by the color of the things that are around it. So a custom color balance can compensate for all of that and give you the exact perfect color balance, though you have to set it up for each shot, so usually automatic is good enough. And then another thing buried deep in the menus of your camera is the picture control. And the picture control affects how JPEGs are processed. So if you're shooting in RAW, the picture control does nothing at all. But if you're shooting in JPEG, then the settings in the picture control make a big difference in how the picture comes out. And so if you want to post-process your images and you want to change the color saturation later, then it's best to turn the saturation down, because you can easily blow out one of your color channels if you have it too saturated with an image, and then you can never desaturate it. However, if you're not going to process your images and you're just going to upload them without running them through a photo editor, you usually want to turn your saturation up more, because then the colors are more vivid. And you generally want the colors to be pretty vivid, but then if you have the colors too vivid, it just looks ridiculous. So if you're not going to do any post-processing, then it's a good idea to pay a lot of attention to this and set it just right so the colors are vivid, but not too much. And then this histogram is another really good feature that the camera gives you, and the histogram is used for setting the exposure. And the histogram tells you what the exposure should be set to. So here's the histogram here, and what the histogram is it's a graph, and it shows the distribution of brightnesses of the image. So on this graph, you can see that there's a lot of white in the image, but this graph, everything is in the middle. And so nothing is too bright. And so the thing you mostly want to look for is if anything on the graph touches the right-hand side and starts to go up the right-hand side of the graph, that means you're clipping highlights and you're losing data. So if you have like the sky in your image and you don't care about the detail in the sky, then it's okay to have some clipping, because it was only the bright stuff is clipping. But very usually you do care about the details in the brightness. So you want to make sure that the histogram is kind of in the middle. And then if you're shooting and it's way too dark, then this histogram is all shifted to the left, and then everything is going to be over on this side. And that is okay, except that when you go to raise that, and later in Photoshop shift it back to the right, then you're adding a whole lot of digital noise. And that's a bigger problem if you shot with a higher ISO, and a smaller problem if you shot with lower ISO. It's always best to have your distribution sort of in the middle. So here is what's called the RGB histogram, and that just shows you the histogram for each individual color. And that is good because sometimes if it's like a red thing, if it's a red mushroom you're shooting, only the red channel will be blown out, but the other channels will be fine. So this way you can check all of them separately and just make sure that none of these channels have anything touching the right-hand side of the graph. And that looks good here. A lot of times what you can do is when you're in image playback mode, you can turn on the RGB histogram and then you can zoom around your image. And so here we've zoomed in to the flower here, and then we're looking at the histogram here. And what I'll usually do is zoom into the brightest part of the mushroom and just make sure that none of these is touching the right-hand side on the brightest part of my mushroom, and then I know the exposure is set correctly. And if it is touching the right-hand side, then you just turn the exposure compensation down so your image is darker. And here's one where it's an example of a blown-out image. And you can see that on all of the channels, it's touching the right-hand side, it's going up the right-hand side. So that means all of the detail in these lighter parts of the image is gone, and you can, if you make the image darker again in Photoshop, you'll never get the detail back in those brighter parts. And here's an image that I use focus stacking for, and so we've already talked about focus stacking a bunch, but in this image, I put together 120 photos, and about 80 of them are just this part of the stem here. And usually when you take a picture like this, the parts that are closest to the camera are very blurry and you can't see them. So focus stacking can solve that problem and make the parts that are closest to the camera nice and sharp. But the closer it is to the camera, the more images you need to stack. So it's like 50 photos to go from here to here, and then 30 photos to go from here to here, and 20 photos to go from here to here, and the whole cap is probably 10 pictures. So, the slices get a whole lot larger the further away the subject is from the lens. But I have the aperture all the way open here, so that means the background is very blurry. And when the background is very blurry, then your eye is drawn to the mushroom and not distracted by the background. Here is a photo that I took 2 days ago at 3 in the morning in Maryland, and this is Omphalota salivacens. So this is a bioluminescent mushroom, and bioluminescence is pretty hard to capture, but there's a lot of things you can do to make it better. So the most important thing that you need to do to capture bioluminescence or any really dark scene is to make the exposure time longer. So I did 30 seconds exposure here, and on a lot of cameras you can make it even much longer, like 10 minutes or something. But when you're doing that, then you can't use the automatic focus stacking modes. So I also like to use focus stacking when I'm trying to capture bioluminescence, because I always have the aperture all the way open, because when the aperture is all the way open, then it is gathering the most light possible. However, when the aperture is all the way open, then you only get a small slice of the image in focus, and like you won't have all of the closer stuff and the further stuff. So I have to combine a bunch of images. So what I did for this one is I set the camera up in front of the mushrooms, and at first I couldn't see any glow at all. But after about 5 minutes, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I could see that there was just a ridiculously super faint glow. And the fainter it is, the more challenging it is to capture.
You could see that with your eye.
I could, but I had to sit there in complete darkness for 5 minutes before I could start to see it.
Okay.
So if it's a really bright bioluminescent mushroom, you don't have to let your eyes adjust at all. You can just turn the lights off and instantly you'll see it glowing.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the really bright ones, you can like throw the mushroom and it looks like a shooting star going through your vision because they're just like ridiculously bright. And those are super easy to photograph. Even with a cell phone, you can, on night mode, you can take amazing shots of those really bright mushrooms. This one was super dim. It's probably because it was really cold, so that slows down the chemical reactions. Also, it's just not a very bright species. And so there's no way I would have been able to capture anything more than a green blur on a cell phone with this.
Does that species grow in the East? I thought that was a Western.
Did I say olivascens?
Yeah.
I must have, what it actually was Omphalodus illudens.
Right, okay.
So you get 3 Omphalodus in the United States, olivascens on the west, illudens in the east, and subilludens in the south. And all of them are bioluminescent. But I think subilludens is the really bright one, because all the bioluminescent shots that I see from like Florida or Texas come out really well, and all the ones that you see from like Massachusetts, they did not come out very well.
The one time that I saw illudens really brightly glow, the gills were all glowing really well. And I didn't get a picture of it, that's a long time ago, I don't even think I had a digital camera back then, but I still had to let my eyes adjust to the darkness.
It's just not a very bright mushroom.
But this one though, really, once my eyes adjusted, it was dramatic, I could see everything.
Yeah, and you know, there's just a lot of variation in mushrooms, and it's the same across all mushrooms and all plants, whereas, you know, there could be like 10 times more of a certain chemical in one mushroom versus the next. So a glowing mushroom can be 10 times brighter, or if it's like a medicinal mushroom, one mushroom can easily be 10 times stronger than the one growing right next to it. And it's just, you know, one of the problems with natural medicine is that the distribution of chemicals in plants and mushrooms is extremely variable.
Yeah, this one that I saw that was very bright, it was a pretty freshly fruited mushroom that was pretty much almost mature, but I harvested it and went directly into a closet with absolutely no light.
Yeah, and as they start to dry out, the light goes away, so it's good to you know, do that soon.
Did you say you shot this for 30 seconds?
So this is a 30-second exposure.
So-
However, I also did focus stacking. So what I did is I set the focus on the camera to be focused a little bit closer than the closest part of this cap. And then I used the histogram to set my exposure time. And since I knew my exposure time was 30 seconds, because that's the maximum that the camera can do when it's focus stacking, I was actually using the histogram to set the ISO. And so I took a test shot for 30 seconds with like ISO 200,000, and I noticed that the green channel was blown out. And so I just turned the ISO down until the green channel looked really good in the histogram, not touching the right-hand side. And that meant that the correct ISO for this shot was 16,000. And so 16,000 is still really high because these mushrooms are really dim. And also the moon was at 14%. And so the moon was way brighter than the glow on these mushrooms. But it's kind of cool because you get a little bit of moonlight lighting up the mushrooms.
Did you view the histogram in the field, or
Yes.
okay?
Yeah.
And is
So
that
I did-
on your camera?
Yeah, so I take the test shot, and then when I'm viewing the images, if I hit the display button, it cycles through a few different display modes, and one of them shows the histogram right on the screen there when I'm viewing the image. And then if I hit the zoom button while I'm in that mode, then it shows the histogram just for that part, so I can like zoom in to the brightest part of the image and make sure the histogram still looks good even in the bright part. And that's really important if the most important part of your image is really tiny and is really bright. Because it's really easy to accidentally blow out the highlights on a very small part of your image, because the camera is metering the light for most of the image, and it's not metering the light for all of your image. But if you want to preserve the highlights, which you generally do, on a lot of cameras, like my Nikon, you can turn on what's called highlight weighted metering, and then it'll weight the highlights a whole lot more than it weights a lot of the rest of the image.
So if you had shot this for 60 seconds instead of 30, it would have blown out all these highlights.
Yes, so if what I could have done then is I could have put the ISO one stop down and then go to 60 seconds, and then it would have half as much digital noise. Or I could have put the shutter 5 clicks slower, which would have put me probably about 3 minutes, and then I could have put the ISO 5 clicks slower, and then I would still have the same exposure, and I would have had way less digital noise. And so, like, if it's a really bright bioluminescent mushroom, I can get away with like ISO 400 and have almost no digital noise. Whereas something like this, I had to do a lot to process it to get the noise. But in any case, for this, I set the focus to be a little bit closer than the closest part of the mushroom, and then I set the ISO to 16,000, and then I set the shutter speed to 30 seconds on manual mode, and then I turned on the focus stacking, and I very carefully walked away from the camera, and I had it stacking 35 photos. So 35 photos at 30 seconds each is about 17 minutes, and so I walked about 100 feet away before I turned on any kind of light, just kind of stumbled through the woods for about 100 feet. And then I set a timer for 17 minutes on my phone so I'd know when it was safe to go back without ruining my shot. And then just like, check my emails and did stuff like that for 17 minutes while I was exposing and taking the 30-second exposures. But a lot of times what I will do is instead I'll use the timer mode on the exposure. And what the time exposure does is that you hit the shutter button and then the shutter stays open until you hit the shutter button again. So you could leave the shutter button open for hours if you want, but after a while you get diminishing returns and you get more noise. So usually if I'm trying to get kind of like the best of both worlds and really capture something dim, something around between 2 and 10 minutes will give you the best results. But if your shutter's open that long, your camera better not be moving at all. So I had the camera just laying directly on the ground, and I kind of like forced my camera just with a lot of weight on it, just like to jam it into the ground so it wouldn't be slowly settling as I was taking this picture.
Yeah, I would imagine also the subject can't move at
It
all.
better not move at all. These mushrooms were huge, massive omphalotus. They were probably the biggest ones I'd ever seen, so they weren't going anywhere. And then I tried a bunch of different post-processing methods to try to get the best image, and some of them worked a whole lot better than others. So one thing I tried is just stacking all of the JPEGs, and then loading that into Photoshop, and there was a ton of noise. It was just so grainy you could barely see the mushrooms because the stacking had multiplied the noise, and so it had 35 times the noise, which is really good if you're like taking pictures of stars, because then you're adding all the light together from all of your exposures. But it's really bad if you're trying to get something like this. So what actually ended up working the best is I had turned on the raw shooting, so I could, and this is what I did is I took all 35 raws and I stacked those together, and it was still super noisy and it added all the noise. So I took all 35 raws, and then I used a new feature that they added to Photoshop and Lightroom within the last year, which is the AI noise reduction. And so I ran all of them through the noise reduction, which took hours. I don't know how many hours because I was sleeping. I just let it run all night. But in the morning, it had reduced the noise on all 35 images. And I had that set to 80%. So if you set it higher, it removes more noise, but also kills more detail. Usually around 70 to 80% is good. But in the morning, I had 35 raw images that had very little noise, and then I was able to stack those. And that one was dramatically better than any of the other ones ways that I tried it.
That's this.
That is this one.
Yeah, neat picture.
Yeah, and this projector kind of sucks, but if you look at the screen, you can actually see it
Yeah,
looks
it looks way better.
way better on the screen than it looks on the projector.
Oh, you see the mushroom.
And that's what projectors always do, is they will,
Really?
they do not do a very good job of the shadows. So a good projector will show you the shadows pretty well, and a cheap projector will not show you the shadows very well. And anything that's shadowed just kind of looks black. And usually when I present, I just bring my own projector because mushroom clubs usually don't have very good projectors. But I flew out here and wasn't able to bring my own. But a really good projector usually costs at least $800.
We'll have a good one tomorrow, sorry.
Well, we didn't know. So that is all I have for you as far as the actual photography stuff, but there's also a lot of really important stuff that is not actual photography stuff, like managing the files. And so what I do is I will put every day's shooting into a different directory. And so the directory, the file name, and then the directory name starts out with the year, and then the month, and then the day. And that way I can just sort it by file name, and it sorts it by date in the directory. And then I put the location in the directory name, and that way I can just find the directory that has the location. But usually if I'm trying to find files from a while ago, what I'm doing is searching iNaturalist for that thing, and then I'll know the exact day, and then I can go to the right directory for that day. And then I will process the images, and after I'm done processing it, I kind of add this -done to the file name so I know which ones I have run through Photoshop and are ready to upload versus which ones are in more of an unprocessed state. And then if you don't back up your data, you don't really own it. And you'll have a hurricane or a fire, and it's just going to wipe out everything. So I use this thing called Backblaze, and it costs $7 a month, and then it just automatically backs up all the data in your hard drive. And then it's kind of in the cloud, so even if there's a hurricane that wipes out their data center, it's still, unless there's like a worldwide event, you can still get your data back. And this one is pretty cool because you can connect as many external hard drives as you want to your computer, and they all get backed up for the same $7 a month. So I think I have 5 external hard drives, so it ends up being about 20 terabytes of storage. So $7 a month to back up 20 terabytes is an amazing deal. But it's also really nice because if you're traveling and you don't have all of your external hard drives, you can just log into the Backblaze interface and then download the files that you need. And it's also kind of cool because you don't have to download everything. They'll just mail you all your data on a hard drive, and then if you mail them back the hard drive, then it's free. Another good way to store your images is on Mushroom Observer, because if you add your images to Mushroom Observer, it stores the full-size image. When you add your images to iNaturalist, it reduces all of the file sizes to about 600 kilobytes, so you lose a lot of the detail. Another good place to store full-size images is Wikipedia.
Can I just throw out that they just developed for Mushroom Observer a way to really simply, you can enter an MO and it'll transfer it to iNat for really quickly.
Isn't it the other way around in that it pulls from iNat to MO?
You can do both now.
You can do both now, but to go from MO to iNat, you run Jacob Polk's script.
It's a different thing. The guy in Oregon worked it out.
Yeah, Joe Cohen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen that new functionality, but I thought that it was on Mushroom Observer, and you type an iNat number and it pulls it in. But maybe it goes both ways, and it's certainly possible if he's using the iNaturalist API that he could push as well, which would be really cool.
It could potentially change the way people do their stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would be really great.
Can you pull in a whole bunch of observations?
I've got a link, they sent me a
MO
link.
to iNat?
I can forward you the link.
Yeah, what if
Yes, you can do a whole bunch of observations from MO to iNat using Jacob Polk's Python
Yeah, I
script.
looked at that. I after the first, like 2 sentences, I just said, it'll take me a year.
Yeah,
to
it is
do
only
this.
command line. It would be really cool to put that up on a web page. A lot of times when I write Python scripts, I'll just attach them to a web server, and that way anybody with the web browser can run them. And that certainly could be done.
The problem I might have though is my MO observations, most of them don't have GPS, so then iNat might not want them.
Well, they still want them because it will have a named location, so it'll just put them inside that bounding box.
And
so
so we'll
it's-
do that on iNat?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the script is really written very well. Jacob did a lot of thinking when he wrote that script, and he kind of like made it do the best possible thing in a lot of different ways. For example, if you have a DNA sequence on your MO, it'll add it to the DNA barcode ITS field on iNaturalist. And if you have an herbarium record, it'll add that to iNaturalist. And then if you run the script multiple times, it won't make duplicate records. And so because iNaturalist reduces the file size so much, both by resizing it and by adding a lot of image compression, it's always best to upload to Mushroom Observer first and then pull it to iNaturalist, because that way you have the original file size. If you were to do it the other way, then you only have the small size files. Also, you know, no website lasts forever, and you never know which one's going to last longer, Mushroom Observer or iNaturalist. iNaturalist is much larger, so it costs a lot of money to keep iNaturalist running. And so if the funding runs out on iNaturalist, like they don't get their grant or something like that, it would take a very rich person if they're like, oh, I'm going to cover it just out of my own pocket. But Mushroom Observer is just 2 servers, and someone could decide, if Mushroom Observer had no funding, someone could decide like, yeah, I got an extra $100 a month, I'll just keep Mushroom Observer running. Both sites do have long-term contingency plans, but you never know which one is really going to last longer in the, because obviously one of them is going to stop working before the other one. And nobody knows which one that is, so that's another reason to keep everything on both of the sites. So formatting memory cards is a really good idea, and you always format them in the camera. And so what I always do is I will download all of the photos off my memory card onto the computer, and then I'll verify and just make sure that they all copied correctly. And then I will format, I'll format the memory card in the camera. And formatting those memory cards often stops a lot of problems. So a lot of times I'll use the same memory card for years and never format them, and it's just fine. But also sometimes there'll be like some kind of corruption in the file system, and then you'll lose a bunch of data that way. So if you format your memory cards every time you copy stuff off, then you're less likely to lose data. And then the Backblaze will automatically copy all of those images to the cloud, so if something happens to my computer, then I still have all of them.
So it also, if I'm correct, instead of taking all your images and erasing them, it's much quicker to format the memory card. Is it just almost an instant, it'll erase everything on the card?
Yes. Yeah. And it rebuilds the file system, so the file system starts out from scratch, and you'll have no fragmentation. You'll have a very simple file system, and you're much less likely to have problems that way. So probably the most important part of all of this is that once you photograph a mushroom, you should save it. And so it's a really bad idea to take a picture of a mushroom and not save it, because maybe it's something rare, or usually after you have a really cool mushroom picture, your next question is, well, what did I find? And so if you didn't save a dried specimen, then you'll never know what you found. But these days, there's a couple places that do DNA barcoding for free. So you can just dry the mushroom, put it in a sandwich-sized Ziploc bag, and write the iNaturalist number on there, and then throw it in the mail. And you can send it to either the Ohio Mushroom DNA Lab or Stephen Russell at Mycota Lab. And a few months later, then the DNA barcode will get added to your iNaturalist observation. And the person that is validating that DNA barcode will try to figure out what your mushroom is based on what the barcode says, and then they will suggest that name. So it's a really good way to figure out exactly what your mushroom is and figure out if it's a new species, all that kind of stuff. And so you don't need very much of the mushroom for a DNA barcode. When they actually do the DNA sequencing process, they only use a couple milligrams of tissue, and sometimes you can use even much less than that and still get a good DNA barcode. So saving 1 gill is 1,000,000 times better than saving 0 gills. But saving a larger collection is best, because if you've discovered a new species, it's nice to have a good collection that you can use as a holotype to name that species.
So I think Steve Russell generally charges variably depending upon where it's coming from.
Yeah,
Except for when he's
definitely.
having a Myco Blitz, which there's one coming up in about a week or two, I think.
Yeah, so Stephen Russell, I think he usually charges like $1.75 for.
I think it's more than that.
It kind of depends on who it is and what they're doing, I think.
Yeah.
Sometimes he charges more. And I think if you just mail him stuff, it all gets sequenced for free, even if you don't pay, but it's always nice to pay. But the Ohio Mushroom DNA Lab is always free, and then they're just donation-based. So often people just send a bunch of stuff to the Ohio Mushroom DNA Lab, and then maybe send a donation when the results come through, if they can afford it.
So OMDL they're gonna continue to take free submissions for
Yeah.
a while?
Yeah. And actually, Stephen Russell is helping the OMDL a lot. So he pays Ryan. He pays. Is it Ryan Peace? No, it's Brian.
Kyle?
No, his name is Brian. Brian Hunt. So Stephen Russell pays Brian Hunt to take all the mushrooms out of bags and put them into little tubes and then fill out the spreadsheet. That's called sampling. And so OMDL just sends all of their stuff to Brian Hunt, and Stephen Russell sends all of his stuff to Brian Hunt. And Brian Hunt does this all day, every day. Just take little bits of mushroom and put them into tubes. That's his full-time job. And he gets paid out of a grant that Stephen Russell got. And so Stephen Russell is just allowing him to work on Kyle's stuff too, just because it's good for everybody when you have more DNA sequences. And that's helped out a whole lot.
Now, I just asked on Facebook, the OMDL Facebook, I don't know who responded to me. I assumed it might be Kyle.
It could be, but sometimes I'll respond to those too.
Okay, but I asked if it was all right if I documented my samples with MO numbers. And the reply I got was that INAT is preferred, but MO is all right.
Yeah, and the problem is with the data processing, because all of this stuff, like with the automated data processing, is a lot easier on iNaturalist, because that's where Stephen Russell put his development effort in. And so he, when you're on the back end of Micromap and you're actually processing the DNA sequences and validating them, there's a little button to import it to iNaturalist. And Mushroom Observer, you just have to do it a little bit differently. And he did add Mushroom Observer support. I think what Kyle is going to do is take all of the Mushroom Observer ones and then put them aside and then run a batch with only Mushroom Observer. And that'll make the data processing easier, but it'll make it take longer to get
Because
through.
that's what I use. I just always used it. I like it better.
Yeah, it is in many ways better and in many ways worse. They they'll never be equivalent, nor should they be. Just use what you like more, but it definitely makes it a little bit more difficult for the DNA sequence processing.
So if I send MO tagged specimens, it's probably going to take longer.
I think so, because he's going to do a full run of Mushroom Observer
Right.
stuff.
Well, that's good to know he's going to do it that way, though. Then I know it's not just going to be forgotten. Okay, thanks.
And he also does that with chanterelles. So chanterelles don't work through the standard sequencing process, but he's actually doing a batch of nothing but chanterelles as we speak.
Are they going to do other than ITS?
Yeah, he's going to do ITS and RPB2, both of them with nanopore. And just a batch of...
Because ITS doesn't delineate very well in some genera.
Yeah, ITS works really well 99% of the time, but about 1% of the time, adding additional genes will be able to differentiate between closely related species.
I think a long time ago, when I say a long time ago, 10 years ago, Michael Quo had on his website that what we now call Morchella diminutiva was the same species as what we now call Morchella americana.
Not diminutiva. Diminutiva is a really small one.
I know.
It was Esculentoides that was merged into Americana.
Not that. No, I think for a short time he was saying that these tiny ones, the diminutiva, were the same species.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Because
but
the ITS is not different enough. They're both in section Morchella.
I would have to check that. I'd be a little bit surprised if that's the case, but it is possible. I
It's
do
changed
know.
now, it doesn't say that anymore.
Yeah, I think those ones are far enough apart because they're not even in the same section. Because it's
No, but
diminutiva in section
That's in Morchella. for sure.
distantes. I think it's in distantes.
No,
I could be wrong.
I think it's in Morchella.
Well, we can really easily pull up the DNA sequences, but should probably do that a different day since we'll focus on photography today.
So is chanterelle chanterelle requires a different technique for
Yes.
sequencing? Is hypnum in that too?
No, only chanterelles. And even like the black trumpets and the craterellus will sequence just fine. It's just only the genus Cantharellus. It
Are
does
you
not
here
work
for
very
the
well.
conference also, Nick?
What's that?
You're here for the whole conference?
Not the whole, no.
Oh, because Rachel will be here, and that's exactly what
Oh,
she
really?
spent
Yeah.
a couple of years on.
I'll be here Saturday. I don't know if she's going to be speaking Saturday.
I think she might be, she's a wealth of information.
How about, section lepidella sensu boss?
Those are difficult to sequence,
That's
and
what
I
I
have
thought.
had the best luck sequencing those by using different primers that get a shorter part of the ITS. So that's certainly possible to do, but it just takes a little bit of extra lab work, and when you're running 1,000 at a time and doing them all with the
Right,
same
yeah.
procedure, that's not really going to happen. But with a home DNA lab, you can certainly keep running it with different primers until you get it right, and I've been able to get those to work that way.
And are those done with ITS also, or is there a different part of the genome that's?
ITS has problems with those because there's a whole bunch of copies of ITS in the genome that are not the same.
Oh.
And then when you sequence them, they got all of these different ITS genes all reading on top of each other, and they all kind of clash together. It might be possible to grab the FASTQ file from the nanopore read and pull out all those different haplotypes, and then you would have all of the different
Oh.
sequences, and you can add them
Oh,
separately.
yeah, because that gives you all the different
Mhm.
sequences that are being run at the same time.
Exactly, yeah. And so anytime that a nanopore sequence is added to iNaturalist, he also has the link for the trace file, and that'll give you the FASTQ.
Right.
And then you can load that in with Eugene and see all of the raw reads.
Can I request we go back to photography? This is a huge subject.
Yep.
And there's,
So it's a really good idea to save everything in a tackle box, and the tackle box keeps everything separate and keeps it from getting crushed. One way to dry them is just behind the computer, because a lot of computers have a big CPU fan and just blow hot air out behind them all night. And so if it's kind of a thin mushroom or a thin slice of a larger mushroom, or just like a little mycena or something, will dry really well just behind the computer all night. But usually when I'm traveling, I dry them on the dashboard, and I'll just throw the mushrooms up on the dashboard and drive around for a few days. And that works really well, because there's always a lot of air movement there. But for tiny mushrooms, they'll all get mixed up if you have 20 mycena collections. So I'll put them in these paper bags for the little tiny ones, and then write the iNaturalist number, or if there isn't one yet, I'll write the date and the species and the time and maybe a collection number on the bags, and then just drive around for a few days until they're super dry, and then I'll put them into Ziplocs.
Now, Linus Kuzma has told me that if material is dried at too low a temperature, he doesn't get any good results. Now, he uses Sanger.
Well, usually people say that if it's dried at too high of a temperature,
That's what I saw on the OMDL website.
because drying at low temperatures tends to preserve more things. There's very very few chemicals that break down more at low temperatures than there are at higher temperatures. So yeah, that's really surprising if that's really what he's seeing, is that low temperatures
That's
are
what he has told
worse.
me. And Igor Sevenov told me that
And what's he saying? What's a low temperature? Like 95 or 45?
Igor tells me that, and Linus, I think, says the same thing. 115 to 125 is optimal, and that's some Chinese study suggested that.
Yeah, usually they work fine no matter what temperature you dry them at.
I see. Okay, because I usually set at around 117 or somewhere.
Yeah, that sounds like a good temperature. I usually will, when I have a choice, I'll set it to like 95 or 105. Just because usually the problem in DNA sequencing is that the DNA chains break, and the higher temperatures they break more. But it'll work fine no matter what
One time I
temperature.
tried out some destroying angels for Rob Tillos, and I thought, well, I'm gonna make sure these are real nice when they're dried. So I air dried them for a while, just hung in an attic window, and then finished them in the dryer. And he sent them to Linus, and he got nothing out of them.
And maybe there was like yeast or bacteria growing on them that was like
Yeah,
munching on the
maybe.
DNA.
Maybe, but
That could definitely
the
be an issue.
conclusion they came to was that they were dried at too
I want
low
to dry
temperature.
quicker. That makes sense. So it's a really good idea to add collection numbers to stuff. And the reason is that a lot of dried mushrooms look very similar. And so, especially after a few days or weeks or months or years, all the dried mushrooms start to look the same. So if you have some collection numbers, then what you do is you take, when you're in the field with the mushrooms, you put the collection number in the frame and you take a picture with that collection number there, and then you put it on your dehydrator, and that way you'll never have to wonder which photos go with which dried mushrooms. So I upload all of my photos to both Mushroom Observer and iNaturalist. And there is a script that moves everything from Mushroom Observer to iNaturalist, so maybe a good workflow is to put everything in Mushroom Observer, and at the end of the day, run that script that copies everything over to iNaturalist. And then Wikipedia is also a really good place, because when you put stuff on Wikipedia, it has a free license, which allows commercial use. So, like I've uploaded photos to Wikipedia and then been shopping in Target and seen my photos like on t-shirts in Target, or you'll be watching the news and they'll have like your photo come up on the news, because people know that that's a good place to get freely licensed images. And then I like to post them to Instagram, because a really good mushroom photo can get a lot of people really excited about mushrooms, and it can maybe change their life, because the more interested they get in mushrooms, the more that they're going outside and studying nature and caring about conserving the biodiversity that we have left. Instagram is really good just for getting it in front of a lot of eyeballs, but Facebook is usually the best website for discussing mushrooms, because they have all of those different Facebook groups. Like there's a Facebook group for Russula, where all the world experts on Russula are, and a Facebook group for Cortinarius, and really every genus out there. And then there's also a Facebook group for each state. So you have all the local people that know the mushrooms around them. And then I also like Bay Photo and Artbeat Studios for printing out my images. So if you upload a high resolution JPEG to Bay Photo or Artbeat Studios, you can have them printed out on metal or on photo paper, or any of these different options. These here are all my photos printed on metal, and they look really good on metal. It's really high resolution, and then you don't need a frame. And so that's usually how I have them done.